it going, folks? I'm Matt. This is Photosynthetic. Welcome to another episode of Meet the Industry. You may recognize today's guest. He's known for his podcast that goes very deep into many facets of the cannabis world, as well as owner of KiS Organics. Everyone, Tad Hussey. Tad, welcome to the show. Big fan, man. Just stoked to have you here, sir.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah.
All right. And guys, if you like what I'm doing here, down below, link to Patreon. I always appreciate the support. So, Tad, you've got all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, you got KiS Organics, you've got the Cannabis, Cultivation, and Science podcast, plus you've got a few other projects that I've heard about as well. But before we really get into all of that stuff, can we just maybe find out a little bit about yourself, your background, and how KiS Organics came to be?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, came back from getting my master's degree in Australia back in 2005, and having grown up on with my parents owning a plant nursery and landscaping business on 7 acres, pretty much my whole childhood. I'd been around plants my whole life. And I got back from there, and my father had sold the nursery and started a compost tea business selling compost tea brewers. And so I came in and started helping him with that. This was when the internet was still sort of in its infancy back in 1999 that he sort of started that side of things. But so when I got back in around 2005, 2006, I needed a job. I was fortunate enough that my parents were able to offer me a role with this business. And so it started off selling compost tea brewers. And from that, I started getting all these phone calls, people asking like, hey, I want to grow 30 tomatoes in my basement. How do I use compost tea? Well, it didn't take me long to figure out that they weren't growing tomatoes. And I started exploring a little bit more about the cannabis industry because I'd never used cannabis. It wasn't something I'd ever really come in contact with, honestly. And so when I started to look into the growing side of things, I found this forum called IC Mag, the organic soil section of there. And I met a lot of people that are relatively well known now, like Clackamas Coot, Jeremy from Build a Soil joined a little bit later in that group, and many others. Tim Wilson, who has Microbe Organics, and we just were having conversations about soils and growing and things like that. And I learned a lot from these people.
For sure.
And during that whole process, I decided I wanted to make my own soil, and I found I couldn't get 2 pounds of kelp meal or, neem cake or karanja and all these things. So I realized, being in the Northwest and we have all these amendments, I incorporate into our compost tea business this idea of selling smaller amounts of amendments for growers all around the country. And so we started doing that. It took a while, but it eventually started to take off. And then in 2011, we expanded onto this, where my parents used to have a nursery and landscape company. We set up an urban farm business. So we had chickens and ducks and goats and pigs and a community greenhouse, outdoor preschool. We were a feed store. We were selling edible landscaping plants. It was awesome. And then that recently changed again. We shut that down. And now KiS Organics is strictly the online business. We're focused on soils and primarily work with the cannabis industry. But we've been making, what people call living soils now since probably about 2010, 2011. And so almost a decade now. Yeah.
Right on. And you guys are playing in that spot where I think everybody really needs to be getting into, and that's organics. I mean, organics are going to save the planet. I am fully convinced that if we get everybody growing organically, we could save the planet. But I mean, to that point, why grow organic to begin with, other than, the good environmental benefits?
Well, that big one is the environmental and health benefits. We destroyed a lot of our topsoil through erosion. Everyone's familiar with the Dust Bowl and some of the things that we've done with conventional agriculture that's really made it hard to sustainably grow food. And along those lines, beyond just the environmental benefits, like you mentioned, there's a lot of purported health benefits associated with it. There's less risk around pesticides and fungicides and a lot of the things that are being applied on conventional crops, where we don't always know how these chemistries work together or what their effects are when we're combusting a flower in this case with cannabis. So I think that as growers become, or as the market becomes more savvy, we're going to see a higher value add with organic growing. Because right now you can't get your product certified organic, but people I think are aware of who's growing organically and who's not, and there's ways around sort of that to get the message out to people in terms of how your farm's growing. So um, yeah, we think it's the way to grow. I don't want to have you know glyphosate and other things on or around my my food or my medicine. So
Scary stuff for sure. So, do you look at certification for organics as being a large barrier to overall adoption?
we've done some podcasts on this. It's really interesting. Dr. Bronner's has gotten involved with a Sun and Earth certification that primarily only applies to outdoor farms, but sort of like a beyond regenerative sort of a certification. And then Kind, Certified Kind is one run by Andrew Black that would allow a cannabis farm to get certified to the same standards as what the NOP uses, which is the National Organic Program. That's when you see these USDA certified crops. That's the standard they're using. There's other certifications out there that may be a little bit more well known, but they're not certifying to the same stringent level. And so for me, that doesn't have value. Like I work with a farm in Puerto Rico,
Yep.
one of the largest cannabis producers there, and they had gotten the certification, and then they sent me the list of what they were using, and a lot of the things they had weren't even organic. And so I called the certifier, and they're like, "Well, they're trying to be more organic," so I gave them the certification. Well, to me, that doesn't have a lot of value. So
Yeah.
it's a murky area. I hope certified kind can kind of capture the market, but who knows? But at the end of the day, if the consumer isn't aware of what that certification brings to the table, and doesn't really care about the certification, then there's no real value added reason for a farm to get certified beyond their own ethics. Because the idea is if you have this certification, you should be able to get this much more per gram or this much more per ounce for your product, because people have more confidence in the way it's grown and it's being regulated and inspected.
Fair enough, fair enough. And it's really got to be up to industry to help push some of those changes too, because where you have inefficiency, you have people who squeak by, who try to I guess get past those blockages in the system to help prevent bad things from getting to the market. But for the home grower, then, for somebody who's looking to get into organics, it can be quite daunting. I mean, let's face it, growing from a bottle, it's easy. You've got that recipe on the side, 2 mils of this, 2 mils of that. But for the organic grower, I mean, it can be very confusing. Kelp meal, compost, teas, inoculation, for example. What advice do you give to somebody looking to start out?
That's a great question. Before I dive into that, I just want to highlight something you mentioned in terms of the risks associated with buying cannabis from people you don't know. Here in Washington, that was a huge problem. We had a lot of issues with various pesticides that were illegal being sprayed on crops, issues with heavy metals, issues with microbial contamination. And then even on the supply side, many people would be familiar with Guardian Mite Spray or with Mighty Wash. These were products they claimed to be natural and organic. Turns out they were putting pyrethrins and other things in there. Or in the case of Guardian, actual things I believe were known to cause cancer. So you really have to do your due diligence, and it's another reason to grow your own. Now, getting into your question about growing your own, you were asking me why, or what's the easiest way to do this?
Yeah, yeah. For the beginner and stuff, how should they
Yeah,
go about getting started?
sure. There's a lot of different recipes online. It takes a while to get the right recipe, and for me, that recipe is all based off of my compost or earthworm casting source.
Yeah.
If we're talking about organics, so a lot of people will follow something called Coots Mix. It's just the neem, crab, kelp, and some rock dust. It's a pretty standard, easy mix to use. With our soils, we've taken it a little step further with lab testing and mineral balancing to try and just further the process along. But there's a lot of great recipes out there. We have some right on our website if people want to go and start playing around with their own. But I think the best thing you can do is really just, keep it simple and not try and do too much at first. I think that's where people get in trouble is, especially with new growers, they tend to over apply nutrients trying to push things, or they tend to over water. And that's where sometimes less is more, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, watering's always the big one too, especially for the new grower, that skill that they're trying to learn. But even, experienced growers tend to have issues with that. Things like blue mats, though, certainly help in that regard. But I guess in that sense, what do you feel that most experienced growers, especially on the organic side, are doing wrong?
Oh, I think the two things I've seen happen the most when we talk about like commercial facilities is one, it would be the lighting, not measuring your PAR or PPFD levels. I've
Okay.
found in some cases these facilities would go multiple crops where their PPFD was low enough that they really the CO2 supplementation probably wasn't making a difference. And sometimes, just getting the lights to the right level relative to the canopy can increase your yields dramatically. So that would be one. The second one would, well, okay, now I have three. So the second one would be soil testing. So if you're going to be reusing your soil, you really do need to balance it, because your genetics and the way you water and all of your inputs will affect how your soil finishes every cycle. And so we need to be making adjustments for that in order to optimize your grow on a commercial scale. If we're talking about indoors, and you're talking about like a small medical grow or your individual plants, probably not an issue. But if you're cultivating commercially, I think it's a must that you do that. And then the last thing would be, I think sometimes growers get caught up in this idea again of adding all these different products, or hearing that you need to add so many different things, and so they do it all at once, and then you really have no controls, and you have no idea what products gave you a good ROI or worth adding, and which ones really didn't have the benefit that you thought they would. So again, it all goes back to sort of simplifying the growing process.
Yeah, and I mean that's the name of the business, right? Keep it simple, organics. So then
Yeah.
turning to the podcast itself, I mean, if guys, if you're watching and you've not listened to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast, you're doing yourself a great disservice. So Dad, I'd like to know, how did that come to be? What was the catalyst that made you say, I need to bring knowledge to the people?
Well, so coming from a nursery and landscaping background, I'd had a lot of experience with plants. But then I decided I wanted to grow cannabis, and I walked into a hydro shop, and it was like nothing I'd ever experienced, because I grew up with my parents essentially owning a garden center. So you walk into a hydro shop and it's like all these white bottles on a shelf. There's caricatures of women in bikinis and these monster plants on the labels. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen or heard of. And I found myself thinking I needed these things in order to grow cannabis. Well, I started doing a little more research. I started reading the labels and realizing these are the exact same things that we're using in the garden center for, with 1,000% markup or even more in some cases. So I got into it more. I started learning. I decided I wanted to write a book. And I realized that a lot of what I wanted to write about, I knew people who knew more than I did about that particular chapter.
Ah, okay.
Podcasts were just coming about, and I was like, well, I know some people right off the bat that I know people would want to hear from. Like, I was good friends with Clackamas Coot. I was good friends with Jeff Lowenfels, and quite a number of other people in the industry. So I thought I would just interview them, and that would be a great way to sort of be this, like, in a way like a book, but also just be this constantly evolving tool or resource, because there's a huge gap between, I think, and it's grown smaller over the years, but when we started, between the cannabis industry and sort of academic research, university research, and these experts. So the goal with the podcast is really to help merge that. And I've been really fortunate to meet some really amazing people through the process, and share some really cool research. So that's really what the podcast is. It's just a way to connect listeners with the researchers.
Yeah, and I think because we're living in a world now where things are becoming more legal, more accepted, and whatnot, we've got more science happening, and to have a podcast as the vehicle to bring that to people makes so much sense, because science changes. We learn new things. You've always got people that are coming into the game, bringing something new. To that though, I'd like to ask, who were some of the most memorable guests, some of your favorites, and what did they really bring to the show?
Well, we're like 80 some episodes in now.
Yeah.
I think we have over 1.6 million downloads. It's really been an incredible journey. For me, one of my favorites was interviewing one of my mentors. His name's Don Marshall. He
Yeah.
was the head of the Lake Washington College. He started their technical school program, horticulture, 30 or 40 years ago now. And he's a good friend and one of the best educators I've ever met. So it was an honor to interview him, and I just love the way he describes plants. So we don't even talk necessarily about cannabis in that podcast, but I think he helps explain to people in good terms how plants eat and how to look at a plant in a way to better understand it and help it grow. So that was probably one of my favorites. But there's been a lot of really really good ones on there. I also got to interview my good friend Justin McGill. That was quite a popular podcast because he was describing sort of the commercial living soil grower perspective and how he does it. I think he's like 28 cycles in now on his soil, and
That's crazy. Yeah.
he's just crushing it. So
Yeah.
it's a yeah, it's a great thing. If people want to check him out, you can go on Instagram. It's at J Magilla, JMAGILLA. So you can see what he's doing over at his grow. Yeah.
Oh, right on, right on. And again, I encourage everybody to go check it out. I personally, I love the Jeff Lowenfels episodes. That dude is just a fountain of information. He just, so much
Yeah.
about the stuff.
Yeah.
Washington State still doesn't allow home growing. How can we change that? What do you think needs to be done to make that happen?
We do have some. You can grow medical.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to register with the state. I went through that process. It's honestly a little bit of a joke, getting someone to sign off on a prescription for you. I don't know. That the politics is not really my side of the coin. I'm more on the cultivation side, but I absolutely do believe that people should have access to be able to grow their own medicine. And I was just talking to a friend of mine today who just finished her first grow, doing this sort of method with living soils and everything. And she realized she probably saved about $800 on what she was able to grow herself. And she was quite happy with the quality versus if she'd had to buy it, because it gets really expensive if people are, using it as medicine. So
Oh yeah,
I don't know what's going to
absolutely.
take to change it, but I totally agree with you. I hope we get there at some point because it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know that the organization Normal is doing what they can to help push that sort of thing along. So if you're looking to donate money, probably a great place to start. We did a fundraiser with the From the Stash guys there a few months back, and it wasn't too bad. Now,
Good.
talking more about growing specifically, you guys have a bunch of different products over at KiS that will greatly aid the home grower. Maybe tell me a few about, pardon me, tell me about a few of them and where somebody should start if they're looking to purchase something.
Sure. So, in terms of our company, probably our most popular product would be our biochar soil. That really makes it easy. You can just literally just water your plant throughout the cycle, and you'll get a good, healthy yield. The one thing I will say for people who do want to get into living soils is if the larger container you use, the more success you'll have, especially when you're using these, what people call super soils, because, I can only put so much nutrients into a given volume of soil. And so a giant plant in a 3-gallon pot just doesn't work like it would with chemical nutrients. So a 7-gallon pot sort of your minimum size. But if you can go to a bed and even do multiple plants in that bed, you will have way less issues. You'll have way more success. And the cost of re-amending that will be pennies compared to what it would be with 7-gallon pots in terms of your labor and money that goes into it. So that's the first consideration. The other product that we have is because shipping soil around the country is really, really expensive. It's heavy stuff. We have a nutrient pack, which allows you to source your own compost and peat moss and perlite or pumice locally, mix it up just like we would in our facility, and then you can have your own soil mix there. We send you all the nutrient and minerals in a package. And then One of the services we offer is you can use that nutrient pack to re-amend your soil. But like I said, over time, with different genetics, different water sources, all of these things will affect how your soil is balanced. And so if you get a soil test, you can send that to us. And if you're using, our nutrient pack and our soils, we'll happily customize a nutrient pack for you. I do it myself for all of our customers. So I'm the one that handles that. And then we can send that out at no additional cost. So those are sort of our main products. And then there's a ton of other things that people get into with, increasing your biology through compost teas or using mycorrhizal fungus or other biostimulants, different fertilizers or soil amendments based on what nutrients you're trying to pick up. You can really go down any kind of rabbit hole, and there's a lot of different things out there. But at the end of the day, you got to remember, cannabis is called weed for a reason. It wants to grow. Don't overthink it. The best thing you can do is just get out there and plant something, even if it's in the soil from your yard. Just get started. That's the most important piece of advice. There's no silver bullet. There's no perfect product. Just start growing.
Yeah. Well, and Dr. Ingham talks about that, how you can grow in a pH, which is, I think she goes, it's 4 to 11 or 5 to 11, and, just talks about a bunch of the stuff around that, how we focus too much on changing inputs as they're going into the soil. So I think having just a good basic understanding that, like you said, it's a weed, it's going to grow, just let it do its thing, is a really good way to go about it. Now, as we talk, of course, about cannabis, this is a plant that's faced much persecution for many, many years. And it's only, recently where it's become legal and people are starting to really recognize the benefits for it. But a lot of the older generation even looks upon it still with disdain. And, I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on what we can do to lessen that stigma, how we can bring things more to the forefront.
Again, that's not totally my world, but I would say, here in Washington State, we've certainly seen the stigma around it decrease with legalization as we've added the recreational market here. We just don't see it as much. And every year it gets better and better. So I hope that will continue. I think adding home growing would be huge. The idea that I could grow a cannabis plant next to my tomatoes would be, without any worry, would be great. But beyond that, I think we just, as an industry, have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. There's a lot of crap that that goes on, and a lot of nefarious people, and unfortunately, I think that just drags the whole industry down, because I think they need to see, people that don't use cannabis need to see that people that do use cannabis are just regular people. There's a lot of, they say, the soccer moms and things like that. Just reducing that stigma and realizing that it's not any different than alcohol or cigarettes or all these other things that people are already using that are legal. So.
Right. And I agree so much. It's just another way for people to, medicate, and some others to relax. Now, getting back to just the garden there, you touched on compost and sourcing compost earlier. If I was to look, locally to try and find something, what am I looking for? Because there's a lot of stuff on the shelves.
Oh boy, that's almost a whole episode on if you want to talk about compost. So
fair enough.
To try and distill it, I would say a couple things. So one, not all compost is created equal. Yeah. There's huge variances in inputs. Local to me, I don't like any of our composts. They're produced way too rapidly, so they're very high in ammonia. They're not finished compost, and so if you really want to get into it, I would say if you don't care, buy worm castings. In general, worm castings are going to be higher quality. They're going to cost a little more, but they're going to be better, especially if there's for your important plants like cannabis, tomatoes, peppers, things like that. But if you do buy compost, the things I always start with are a chemical analysis. So I want to know what minerals are in there. I want to see a heavy metal analysis to find out and make sure that it's safe to use in my garden. I'm not adding heavy metals, because cannabis is a very good dynamic accumulator of heavy metals. And lastly, I'd like to know, if possible, what a biological analysis is on that compost, know what kind of microbes are in there. But a lot of times I end up doing that myself with a microscope, just because I have the ability to take a look at that. So those are sort of the things I look at when I look at compost. if you don't want to dive into it that much, just stick with worm castings or find out what they are using for inputs. Because even just knowing the inputs and knowing how long that compost has been sitting, if you can get compost that's 2 years old, it's 90% of the time it's going to be better than that compost that was processed and made in 2-3 months. So just things to look for.
Oh, fantastic. That's great advice. Now, when we talk about equipment, there's a lot involved, especially growing indoors. What piece of equipment do you think is crucial, though, to the indoor gardener?
Well, I'm a soil guy. So for me, I think high quality soil is where I always want to start. I think you can kind of fix everything else around it. But if you want to talk about something that goes across all styles or methods of growing, I think your lighting is probably the most important thing. There's a huge difference in quality of lights in terms of not so much spectrum, but the efficacy of the light and the PPFD or par rating of a light. So how efficient is your light at converting electricity into photons is the first question. And then the second question is how many photons are going to be hitting the leaf surface of my plant? And that's your PPFD. And that's really important because if that's not high enough, then your plant's not going to be photosynthesizing fast enough to generate the sort of yield and quality that you would want in your growth.
Right on, right on. And certainly, I mean, light is definitely the engine that drives the growth for sure. Now, what about something that's let you down? Have you ever had a piece of equipment fail and cause big issues?
Uh, good question. I think the biggest failure I had was trying to run 2,000-watt HPS lights in a grow tent. Someone told me I could do it. I tried it, and it got up to like 130 degrees or something crazy in the tent, and just fried my plants.
Yeah.
Because the LEDs weren't even a thing when I was doing this kind of thing. So I don't know if that's the equipment letting me down or just me not paying attention and not knowing enough at the time. So yeah, everyone, if you've been growing long enough, you will have had your failures and your crop loss and your mistakes, and that's just part of growing. And you will have to deal with a lot of different insects and things like that too. So
Yes, and I mean pests are a big one. Let's just touch on IPM for a minute. What sort of things do you like to do for IPM in your garden?
Oh boy, I think some of the basic things are just cleanliness. Um, Personally, I think treating don't get clones unless you absolutely have to, because you're probably bringing in some sort of pest and disease, and some of these pests can actually live inside the leaf tissue, so you can't even visually see them. They could have spores of things on there that you're not aware of. So quarantining clones, if you bring them in, dipping them, which is like physically, literally dipping them into the right concentrations of things, and that would be there's some good products for that on the market right now. Suff Oil X is one that my entomologist friend Suzanne Wainwright Evans recommends a lot, and that's something that you could use at a tenth of their application rate as a way of getting a better start. Yeah, I mean, IPM is a huge topic, and every facility or every garden is going to be different. But in general, just think of what you can do to reduce exposure to pests, to keep things clean, to scout your crop really well. And then there's also a variety of beneficial insects that you can use to treat these things, or help control them and prevent them in your garden.
Right on, right on. So I guess you talked about a few products and whatnot. Could you maybe recommend a lesser known product that you think more people should be using in their gardens?
I don't know if this is necessarily lesser known, but I think mycorrhizal fungus is one that's really
Oh,
interesting.
100%.
People can read about it. There's a lot of mycorrhizal products on the market, but most of them are made by only 2 or 3 companies. So looking at the spore count and figuring out which ones, I have a whole article on our blog if people want to read in depth about it. But I think people tend to under apply potassium in flower more so than phosphorus. I think that's really the key to increasing yields. So that's not so much a product, but a key nutrient. I think that people should focus on in flower is looking at raising their K to optimal levels.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Tad, it's just been wonderful having you here on the show today. Enjoyed picking your brain. Just a wealth of knowledge on that podcast of yours. And, aside from the Cannabis Cultivation podcast and YouTube, because you guys have the YouTube channel, and I'll throw links down below, anywhere else folks can find you?
Sure. So you can check out our website, kisorganics.com. And then I have a consulting company with a couple partners called growwithkaizen.com. And that's with a couple of facility owners here in Washington, as well as a couple other people. And that's been really great on the commercial side for large scale facilities. And then I'm starting another podcast called Dope History that I've been working on for a few years now. I'm really excited to share the narratives of people in our industry. You mentioned Normal. One of my first interviews was with Keith Strop, the founder of Normal, and hearing his story and how he founded Normal was quite fascinating. Some of his initial funding came from Playboy, actually, and he talks a little bit about that process. He's a pretty interesting guy, and I look forward to sharing that interview. So,
yeah. We definitely look forward to hearing it. Well, again, Tad, absolutely enjoyed chatting with you today. And I got one last question for you before we let you run, and that's, what do you think is the next big thing for cannabis growing?
Oh, good question. I think we're seeing a lot more crackdown on heavy metals. Yep. And we're seeing a lot more stuff around sustainability. And so my hope is that people, if we do see these regulations come about, it'll result in safer product going out into the industry, because I do think heavy metals are an issue. And I hope that, down the road, not only will there be these regulations around cannabis, but I'll be able to go into a grocery store and know that the heavy metals in my vegetable crops, which are not being tested right now, whether organic or conventionally grown, are low in heavy metals too. So that's probably the big thing that I see on the regulatory side. And then we're just having a ton of advances all the time in cultivation around lighting. We've learned a ton around how to grow more sustainably. And so that's something I've been really excited about on the cultivation side. And I think that's about it.
Right on. Well, guys, links below. Go check them out. Go listen to that podcast. I know I look forward to each episode that comes up. Otherwise, Tad, thanks so much for stopping by today. Absolutely appreciate it, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Tad Hussey, we out.